what's wrong with the argument that we have no free will and the world is causally closed? I think the major difficulty with this argument still is something that Bishop Berkeley already pointed out. It's not the claim that the physical has to be completed by something that is non-physical, but it's the observation that it's not clear what we mean by the physical. It's not clear what we mean by causation. So terms that we think are evident, are self-explanatory, are the terms of somebody who is using a precise language and who is using a mathematical, a physical language. It turns out those terms themselves are extremely squishy. They are weak and very subjective. And that's the point that Berkeley made. Berkeley didn't make the point that there are no atoms, but he made the point that whenever he asks people to give a description to him of what an atom is supposed to be, to give a clear definition of what an atom actually is, he couldn't but observe that they came up with subjective qualities, or qualities that are typical for consciousness, for a mind observing the world and perceiving the world through the phenomena it is, through the experiences in which the world appears to this mind. So people were describing the atoms not as they are, as independent of mind, but how they show themselves to a mind observing them. They come up with ideas like size, for example, which is a mental construct, shape, form, color. All of those make only sense to a mind observing, only sense to a consciousness observing. And this was basically the point that Berkeley was making. He was not saying that the physical has to be complemented by something that is going beyond our senses and beyond our experiences, but he was simply making the point that those who insist that physical reality is the only reality there is don't actually know what they're saying. They don't actually know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're actually pointing to when they're pointing to something being physical. A very similar claim has been made in the 20th century that physicalism is actually a specific form of idealism. It is a form of idealism which is not aware of itself as being an idealist position. And the argument basically goes that if you look closer at how physicalists define reality, you see that they basically take mind or aspects of mind, abstract from them, if you want, they cut away most aspects of mind that are given to us and call only specific mind-like features physical, only those which are tied to sense perception and everything that is given to sense perception, and call that physical. So in other words, they call a specific aspect of consciousness, a specific area, a specific spectrum, if you want to put it in early Wilber language, a specific spectrum of consciousness they call physical reality, and basically name it as something that it's not. They name something that is mind-like, they name it as something different, which is not mind-like, namely something that is external of mind. They name it the physical. Another point that could be made here in connection to this is, and this is something that's come up more and more in the 20th century, the general point that there is no free will rests on the argument that we know what causation is, that we have a very clear conception of what causation is, and that the world is causally closed. And it is causally closed bottom up. So bottom here meaning the smallest observables that you can find, whatever those units might be, you can call them atoms, you can call them whatever, to the biggest things that we can observe. So size in a sense here matters, and the idea is that what happens on the micro level determines what happens on the macro level. So if you understand the principles by which the smallest things are governed, the causal powers which govern the behavior of the smallest parts, if you understand those, you understand the behavior of the macro level. Now, this has been always very a very attractive form of idea to minds which like to think about the world as something that is engineered, that is something that is made of Lego blocks that can be manipulated. Of course, Lego follows this principle. I mean, if you know how the smallest part works, you can basically deduce the behavior of the whole thing by knowing the specific behavior of the small parts. And this ends in Laplace's argument, right? That if you know the exact position of each and every single particle in the universe, you can basically predict all macro structures into the future. So all you need is basically information. All you need is the information about which position certain molecules will lock into, and then you will be able to predict not only the behavior of the molecules and the atoms or the smallest things, but you'll be able to predict the behavior of the macro, the big things. And it turns out this is not how reality works. At least I've not found anyone to really be able to make a really good argument and connect, for example, the macro level with the micro level. What has more and more become in vogue actually is actually to speak of different, as Searle calls them, levels of description. And it seems each and every level of description has its own language, has its own terminology, and you can't really make immediate connections between one level of description and a different level of description. So when your level of description is molecules, you'll use an entirely different language from when your level of description is pistons and sparks, when you're talking about a car engine, for example. And it turns out this is not a trivial distinction. It turns out, if you look at systems theory, for example, in Luhmann, the basic idea is that every single system that comes into existence for observation. And observation is, in Luhmann, basically to make a distinction. So the moment you observe him, you make a distinction. This is something he took from Spencer Brown as an idea. So the moment you observe, you distinguish one state from a different state. So the legal system might make the distinction legal, illegal, the basic foundational distinction. The financial system might make the distinction payment, non-payment. The, if you want, educational system might make the distinction understanding, not understanding. And building on those basic distinctions, systems differentiate themselves. They come up with more and more finer distinctions within those. But the thing is, they can't immediately either touch the world or touch each other. So systems are operationally closed. So the language that you use within one system is meaningful within that one system, but you can't immediately use the same language in a different system. So when we're speaking about spark plugs and sparks and combustion, that's a different concept. It's on a different conceptual level, now taking Searle again, than the level of description which is of molecules. And the problem that arises here is that you can't really make causal connections and causal links between different systems because they are operationally closed. All they can do is they can basically represent each other in their own terminology. So they can have friction with each other, but they can't take in one system can't take in the other system on its own terms. It can only take it in on its very own terms, right? It has to use its own language to represent it. I can't remember how Luhmann called this, but again, it's the idea that systems are operationally closed, and within those, you can speak of causality. You can speak of one thing causing a different thing. So, for example, if your realm of description is, if you're talking about, for example, reasons, so you have the realm of reasons, as some Kantians or new Kantians might put it. Their basic idea is that ideas as ideas matter. And this is something that everybody understands. When we say that we'll meet at 12 o'clock, that's an idea, that's a conception. And that conception makes a difference to you because you don't have just a vague understanding of what we mean when we say we'll meet at 12 o'clock. You have a precise understanding of what it means when we'll meet at 12 o'clock. Even though if you go down to and try to connect that to other realities, like the reality of for example, physical time, it will become very difficult. It actually will become very paradoxical, because my understanding of meeting at 12 o'clock and appearing at 12 o'clock might not match the physical time at which you will appear, right? Even though we'll never appear at the same time at exactly 12 o'clock, you will be always milliseconds and thousands of seconds off from 12 o'clock. Yet both of us have the exactly precise and same understanding of what it means to meet at 12 o'clock. And that's the realm of reasons, if you want to call it. I think McDowell used this terminology. Is it in itself operationally closed, and within that you can speak of causations. You can say that me not knowing that we'll meet at 12 o'clock, I wasn't there. So the reason I wasn't there is because I thought we would meet at 11 or at some different time. Within that system, making causal connections makes sense. But it's obvious how this entire system is constructed. It is a mental construct. It is not something that is in the world out there. 12 o'clock isn't in the world out there. It's not in the precise position of the sun. But it is something inherent to the way we're speaking about reality, and to the way we are adapting to the reality surrounding us. And this kind of feature generally applies to all systems and all levels of descriptions. You can never really jump between different levels of description simply by making causal connections. You can never really establish those. And so the initial idea of Laplace, right, that you can have, if you have the micro, you will have the macro as well, turned out to be false. And not by physical observation, not because we have better theories about physics, but by simply looking at the concept of causation itself, and first figuring out that the concept of causation is not domain specific, in the sense that causation is a concept that you can apply on different domains of observation. Causation is a concept that works in all the different systems in terms of which you can think about the world. It is not a concept that is bound only to the physical realm, and it is not the only system which allows you to speak in a precise manner about causes. All the other systems allow you to use the term as well. So causality is something that is domain independent. It is usable across all domains, and causality is not something that is a feature of reality itself. But causality is a feature of how we make sense of reality, of how we structure experiences or structure those domains of observation so that they are meaningful to us and they have a structure that to us is comprehensible. And causality, by the way, is also something that is deeply embedded in our embodied experience. But this is a different kind of argument. But what we figured out in the course of time was we didn't come up with a better theory of physics, even though I'm sure we did, but I just don't know about it. But we actually came up with a better theory of what causation itself is. And it turns out causation is not what we thought it was. We thought it was something like a billiard ball. Searle uses this metaphor. We usually think of causation as something that's a push-pull relationship, where we imagine that the things that can cause other things to do something are literally small objects, tiny objects, and based on the principle that one object cannot occupy the same space time position of another object, once the object A bumps into object B, it moves it away, right? It pushes it away. And this is usually the conception of causality that we have, but it turns out this is not a full-fledged notion of causality, which, again, works across all the different systems that Luhmann, for example, established, all the different levels of observation that are possible, and micro and macro are just two different possible levels of description. And causation is not the simple thing, the simple physical phenomenon that we naively assumed was out there. So what happened was a becoming aware and owning causality as you being your own mental projection onto the world, your own, if you want, subjective approach to reality, and not being an implicit feature, and a such feature, if you want, of reality. And this changes the entire argument of free will. It changes the argument because you can't simply assume that knowing features about the micro level, you will automatically know the features about the macro level. And knowing features about the micro level, you will know, for example, features about the legal system. You can't. Or features about the educational system, which is again based on the distinction of understanding and not understanding. So far, actually, those links we've never been able to successfully establish those links. All we have been able to do is to show correlations between these different modes of observation and levels of observation, but we have never been able to show immediate links of how you could link from one level of description, from one mode of thinking about reality, to a different mode of thinking about reality. So from knowledge about molecules to make an immediate link to knowledge about hermeneutics or understanding, the thing that education usually deals with. And I think science was running on the relatively naive and almost religious trust that once you have trust in one basic principle that you think is behind everything, you feel secure. You feel secure in the sense that even if you don't know everything, you're pretty sure that in 100 years from now, in 200 years, in 300 years from now, just following that single principle, people will figure it out, right? But you feel that you're on the right side of history. You feel that it is very religious at its heart, because when you ask religious people about their own faith and what people have been doing representing their own faith, what you usually hear is exactly this kind of foundational certitude and peace of mind, if you want, that even they might say, well, Christianity did this and that wrong, and people who identify with it did this and that wrong, but at the end of the day, we're the chosen ones. At the end of the day, we're on the right side of history. And this is a pre-scientific, if you want, and very human experience. And I think this is an experience every one of us shares. That once you get into a specific ideology, it doesn't have to be Christianity, it can be secular as well. Once you get into a specific form of ideology, you feel this kind of certitude that even though you can't make sense of things yet, obviously, because you can't predict certain phenomena, you can't even grasp their most simple manifestations in the language that you've chosen is your language, yet you don't feel particularly worried by that, because you feel like, oh, we'll figure it out in the future, right? We're all on the right side of history. And this has been unfortunately, the not recognized religious attitude driving a lot of scientist endeavors, silently assuming that because you trust so much in this foundational assumption of Laplace's claim of causal closedness between the micro and the macro, that everything else will fall into place in the future, right? You feel like the foundations are there, and you wouldn't really want to doubt them. And the reason you feel so certain about that, and the reason why you feel so secure about that, I would speculatively put into the space, is because you're running on an intuition. You are running on intuition because everybody has an understanding of the intuition that the physicalist assumption is making. The physicalist assumption is again making not some form of reality that is foreign to the everyday person. Everybody understands what physicalism is trying to make as a point, because it's basically running on a specific intuition about what is real and what is given. And the stuff that is given and it is foundationally real to physicalism is just, again, one aspect of the spectrum of consciousness that is out there. But that is available to all of us, and in this regard, comprehensible to all of us. We all understand what the point is that is being made here. And the reason we feel so certain about that, and it gives us the sense that we are in touch with reality here, is because we are in touch, obviously, with our intuitions. Intuitions, or particularly embodied understandings and embodied metaphors and frames, if you look up in Lakoff and Johnson how this works in detail, they give us a sense of certitude because we feel that we're in touch with whatever is given. They are not constructed, they're not just mental constructs out there, but they feel like they're embodied. They feel like they're immediately in our bodies, in something that is as close to you as you could possibly think. And this is where the sense of certitude and feeling that you know something that is really, really foundationally true and will be true in hundreds of years from now, and you don't really worry about that. I think this is where this kind of trust comes from. And on the other hand, the argument that is arguing for free will equally much comes from a certain intuition. And that intuition provides you with the same certitude, but makes you frame reality in a different way. And I wouldn't want to argue that framing reality as being something that is an expression of free will is a much better framing. It's not. It is basically the inverse form of the physicalist assumption. It is equally right and equally wrong, actually, and has very, very similar problems, but that's a different topic for itself. But I try to make a point here, which I don't see many people picking up on, because they assume that causality is clear, that we know what causality is. And of course, once you've made the argument and you insist that causality is nothing but the push-pull kind of thing, and that you insist that it exists from micro to macro, even though you can't really show links between different levels of observation, and we've never been able to show even one such instance of a link between different levels of observation. Once you have insisted that this is how reality is composed and this is how reality is built, you've basically defined free will away. There couldn't be possibly any space for something like the phenomenon of free will to actually exist, because you've basically covered all the universe. And you've done it in a way which is basically infallible. It's a way in which I couldn't make any kind of argument to prove you wrong, that this is not the right kind of position to take, because you could always make the argument, well, I can't show you a connection between different levels of description now, but 200 years from now we will be able to do that. And there's absolutely nothing you can say against that. The only thing we can both do together when we're arguing about this is to clarify more deeply what we actually mean when we say such things and when we make such claims about causality, for example, and to come up with different examples for causality, for how we think that causality actually operates, to have a clearer and better grasp on our foundational terms. This is, I think, the only thing we can do. And once we've clarified those concepts enough, and seeing clearly enough with the help of metaphors and with the help of other concepts, then I think some form of understanding might occur. Otherwise, you will end in this endless discourse around free will and determinism, which is basically hopeless. And it's hopeless because the starting point is unclear. People don't really know what they're saying when they're saying things about causality and reality.